The first thing you hear isn't the scraping of metal or the shriek of a woman who just realized her warranty doesn't cover acts of public works. It's the silence. The specific, heavy silence that falls when a cement mixer, a machine designed to be anything but quiet, kills its engine. I stood on my driveway, phone pressed to my ear, and watched the driver of the first truck from rock-solid concrete give me a sympathetic shrug. 20 tons of rapidly curing potential for my foundation sat inert, held hostage by 2.5 tons of pearl-white American hubris. Across the cul-de-sac, standing with her arms crossed in front of her Cadillac Escalade, parked perfectly sideways, blocking the fire access gate, was Carol Peterson. HOA president, queen of the cul-de-sac, and the primary reason my blood pressure was currently exploring the outer stratosphere. A smug little smile played on her lips. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd found the one unbreakable cog in my meticulously planned machine. "She did it, Dave," I said into the phone, my voice unnaturally calm. "It's a code Karen, full-scale blockade at the fire gate." On the other end of the line, I heard a deep, gravelly chuckle. It was the sound of a man who had spent 30 years dealing with the bureaucratic underbelly of a city and had come out the other side with his sense of humor warped into a powerful weapon. "Copy that, Alex," Dave Johnson's voice boomed. "The street sweeper is 5 minutes out. Tell her not to move." I looked at Carol, resplendent in her beige Lululemon power suit, a monument to suburban tyranny. "Oh, I don't think she plans on it," I whispered. Then, from over the manicured hedges and behind the rows of identical houses, I heard it. A low, guttural rumble that wasn't a cement mixer. The distinct, powerful thrum of a municipal-grade V8 engine. The cavalry was coming. But to understand how we got here, how a disagreement over paint swatches and the proper placement of a porta-potty escalated into a standoff involving city officials and heavy machinery, you have to go back 3 glorious, frustrating, and utterly insane months. You have to go back to the beginning. It all started with a dream. Not a grand Martin Luther King Jr. kind of dream. My dream was smaller, quieter, and smelled faintly of sawdust and solder. After 30 years as a civil engineer, fighting battles against cheapskate developers and their accountants who thought value engineered was a fancy term for, let's see if we can use cardboard instead of steel, I had retired. I was done. My life's work of ensuring bridges didn't collapse and buildings didn't lean was over. Now I had a new project, the Citadel of Solitude. It was a workshop, a 400-square-foot detached structure I planned to build in my painfully boring backyard in the heart of Serenity Meadows Estates. The name was, I admit, a bit much. My wife, bless her heart, called it Alex's Pout House, but I knew its true purpose. It was to be a sanctuary, a fortress built not of stone and mortar, but of double-insulated 2x6 walls, PEX tubing for in-floor radiant heat, and a dedicated 240-volt circuit that could power a table saw capable of ripping through reality itself. The plans were more than blueprints. They were my declaration of independence from a world of meetings that could have been emails. I sat in my home office, the plan spread across my desk like a general's map before a great campaign. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, my backyard was a pristine canvas of HOA-approved fescue grass, as exciting as a saltine cracker. But in my mind's eye, I could see it. The Citadel, with its cedar siding and standing seam metal roof, a monument to competence in a world that so often settled for good enough. There was only one dragon guarding the entrance to my promised land, the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee. How hard can it be? I muttered to myself. A phrase that should be etched onto the tombstones of optimistic fools everywhere. I pulled up their website, a digital fossil from the era of dial-up modems and blinking text. The bylaws were a 150-page PDF document, a labyrinth of legalese so dense and convoluted it felt like it had been written by lawyers who were paid by the word and hated joy. I poured a fresh coffee, sighed the deep, weary sigh of a man about to do textual combat, and began to read. 2 days and 4 pots of coffee later, I was ready. I had my 3D renderings, my material samples neatly arranged in a binder, and a laminated copy of every relevant city ordinance. I was prepared for a review. I was not prepared for Carol Peterson. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building that radiated the beige, soulless energy of a dental office waiting room. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and quiet desperation. About 15 residents were scattered amongst the folding chairs, looking like they were waiting for a verdict rather than discussing community business. And at the front, behind a folding table, sat the board. In the center, like a queen on a throne of particle board, was Carol. She had perfectly coiffed blonde hair that looked like it would shatter if you touched it, and eyes that could measure your lawn's height from 50 paces. She wielded a clipboard and a Bic pen with the grim authority of a hanging judge. When my turn came, I presented my case with the cool, calm precision of an engineer. I laid out the plans, explained the non-invasive construction process, and detailed the timeline. I thought it was a masterpiece of a presentation. Carol peered at my renderings over the top of her reading glasses. She picked up one of my material samples, a piece of the trim I planned to use, and held it under the fluorescent light. "Mr. Miller, is it?" she began, intentionally getting my name wrong. "It's Stevens. It's been Stevens for 48 years. "Stevens," I corrected gently. "Mr. Stevens," she continued undeterred, "your proposed outbuilding—" She said the word outbuilding like it was a contagious disease. "Uses toasted almond for the trim color." "Yes, it's a lovely, warm off-white that complements the cedar siding," I said, feeling my optimism begin to flicker. She tapped a long, manicured finger on a page of the binder in front of her. It was, of course, the bylaws. "The approved exterior accent palette, as you'll see on page 87, subsection C, paragraph 4, is strictly sandy beige or gentle fawn." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. "Carol," I began, trying to sound reasonable and not like a man whose sanity was beginning to fray. "I have the color swatches right here." I produced them from my binder. Toasted almond is functionally, visually, and spiritually identical to sandy beige. If anything, it's 1/100th of a degree less yellow. You'd need a spectrometer to tell the difference. Her smile was thin and completely devoid of warmth. "We are not scientists, Mr. Stevens. We are a community of standards. We cannot have residents going rogue with unapproved shades of beige. It's a slippery slope. Today it's toasted almond. Tomorrow it's canary yellow. Anarchy." A few people in the audience nodded sagely, as if I had, in fact, proposed painting a giant mural of a middle finger on my roof. "The request is denied," she said, her voice dripping with finality. She stamped my application with a big red denied stamp. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Next on the agenda, Mrs. Gable's garden gnome. I sat down, stunned. I watched, mesmerized, as Carol proceeded to spend the next 10 minutes eviscerating a sweet-looking elderly woman whose only crime was owning a cheerful ceramic gnome that, according to Carol's laser-measuring, tape-wielding husband, Bob, was 2 inches taller than the 18-inch maximum height stipulated in the lawn ornamentation section. I walked home in a daze. This wasn't about standards. This wasn't about property values. This was about a woman who had found the one tiny kingdom where her word was absolute law, and she was going to rule it with an iron fist and a color wheel. The war wasn't just about my workshop anymore. It was about principle. That night, I didn't sleep. I declared a one-man war on the HOA bylaws. Fueled by righteous indignation and a truly heroic amount of caffeine, I dove back into that 150-page document. I wasn't just reading it anymore. I was dissecting it, cross-referencing it, looking for the crack in its beige facade. For hours, I found nothing but soul-crushing regulations about mailbox height, acceptable shrubbery, and the number of pets allowed per household. 2.5 comma, which raised some disturbing questions about a resident I'd seen with 2 chihuahuas and a cat. My office became a whirlwind of printed pages, highlighter marks, and muttered curses. And then at 3:17 a.m., I found it. Buried deep within a section from 1998, just after a lengthy treatise on the moral failings of visible trash cans, was Addendum 11B, Regulations pertaining to freestanding accessory structures for the pursuit of artisanal hobbies. It was beautiful. It was a dusty, poorly worded, clearly forgotten masterpiece of bureaucratic oversight. It had been written to allow some long-gone resident to build a pottery kiln in their backyard, and had clearly been drafted by a different, more laissez-faire committee. It stipulated size and safety requirements, of course, but its aesthetic guidelines were laughably vague. It simply stated the structure should be of sound construction and pleasing appearance. There was no mention of sandy beige or gentle fawn, no color palette, no trim restrictions. It was a loophole. A glorious, beautiful loophole, big enough to drive a toasted almond-trimmed truck through. The next morning, I felt a giddy sense of purpose I hadn't felt since I found a fatal flaw in the load-bearing calculations for the Harrison Bridge project. I rewrote my application, rebranding the Citadel of Solitude as an artisanal hobby structure. I printed a fresh copy, along with a highlighted printout of Addendum 11B. I didn't wait for the next meeting. I intercepted Carol during her morning patrol, a ritual where she walked the neighborhood with Bob, her silent, grim-faced husband, pointing out minor infractions. "Morning, Carol," I said, my voice dripping with false cheer. "Just wanted to drop off my revised application for my artisanal hobby structure." I put special emphasis on the new title. She snatched the folder from my hand, her eyes immediately narrowing with suspicion. "I've already denied your outbuilding, Mr. Stevens." "Ah, but this isn't an outbuilding," I countered smoothly. "This is an artisanal hobby structure. Different set of rules. I think you'll find it's in perfect compliance, particularly with the oft-overlooked but still very valid Addendum 11B. Page 112. It's a classic. Really holds up." I watched her read the addendum. I saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. She was trapped. It was a legally binding part of the very document she held so sacred. She looked from the paper to me, her jaw tight. For a moment, I thought she might actually combust. "You'll note," I added, unable to resist twisting the knife, "that pleasing appearance is a subjective term, but I think we can all agree that toasted almond is objectively more pleasing than gentle fawn. Have a serene day." I turned and walked away, not daring to look back, but I could feel the heat of her glare on my neck. A week later, a crisp white envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a letter of approval. It was worded so passive-aggressively that it practically hissed when I unfolded it, but the crucial word was there. Approved. I had won the first battle. I had no idea the war was just beginning. The day the trucks from Solid Foundation Construction arrived was a beautiful Tuesday morning. The air was cool, The sky was a brilliant blue, and the sound of a rumbling diesel engine was music to my ears. Miguel, the foreman, hopped out of the lead truck. He was a sturdy man in his 50s with a kind, weathered face and a look that said he'd seen it all. We shook hands, and his crew began unloading equipment. For about 90 seconds, everything was perfect. Then she appeared. It was like she was summoned by the sound of productive work. Carol strode across her lawn and onto the street, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she announced, her voice cutting through the morning calm. "Work is only permitted to commence between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. It is currently 7:58 a.m. Miguel looked at me and raised an eyebrow. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and held up the screen showing the atomic clock. "Actually, Carol, it's 7:59 and 58, 59, 8 a.m., right on time," I said cheerfully. "We're good to go, Miguel." Miguel gave me a slow grin. "Got it, boss." To his crew, he yelled, "All right, boys, you heard the lady. Time to make some noise." As he walked past me, he muttered under his breath, "Gonna be one of those jobs, huh?" "You have no idea," I replied. "Welcome to Serenity Meadows." That first day set the tone for the entire construction process. Carol's campaign of harassment was a masterclass in petty tyranny. She became a constant hovering presence, a specter of suburban discontent. The next morning, as Miguel's crew was setting the forms for the foundation, she came marching into my backyard with Bob, who was dutifully carrying a 100-foot tape measure. "We're just verifying the setbacks," she announced, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to do. "The bylaws clearly state a 10-foot setback from all property lines." Miguel, to his credit, just sighed and motioned for his guys to stop. He walked over to the corner stake, a metal pin driven into the ground by a licensed surveyor. "Ma'am, the surveyor's pin is right here. We measured off it. We're at 10 feet 6 inches. Gave ourselves a little cushion." Carol wasn't satisfied. She had Bob run the tape from the fence to the wooden form. It read 10 feet 6.5 inches. She stared at the tape, then at Miguel, then back at the tape. "Your tape must be wrong," she declared. Miguel just stared at her. "Ma'am, it's a tape measure. It's not a complex piece of equipment." She huffed, unable to find a flaw in his logic, and marched back to her house. The next day, a certified letter arrived. A formal violation notice. Not for the setbacks, but because the porta-potty, delivered that morning, was placed in a location where its vibrant blue color was visible from the street, causing aesthetic disharmony. I had to have the delivery guys come back and move it 3 feet to the left, behind a bush. Cost me $50. It was a war of inches, of decibels, of shades of blue. Carol was relentless. She would stand on her porch with a decibel meter app on her phone, trying to catch the crew making noise above the approved limit. She never did. She took pictures of a contractor's truck because its tire was technically touching the white line of my driveway for 7 minutes while they unloaded drywall. My favorite was the spackle incident. She sent me an email with the subject line, "Urgent, unapproved building materials." Attached was a blurry photo she'd taken from her window of a bucket of joint compound. The body of the email read, "Mr. Stevens, I do not see Proform all-purpose joint compound on the list of materials you submitted. Please cease all work until you can provide documentation that this brand meets community standards for interior wall finishing." I replied with a link to the Home Depot product page and the sentence, "Carol, it's drywall mud. It's literally the industry standard. I promise you it will be beige adjacent when we're done." The constant harassment was starting to wear on Miguel and his crew, but it had an unintended side effect. It forged us into a team. They were no longer just contractors. They were my brothers in arms. They started calling her the Watcher. "The Watcher is on patrol," one of them would say, and they'd all make sure their shirts were tucked in. It became a running joke, a way to cope with the absurdity. The breaking point, the moment the Cold War turned hot, came on a Wednesday afternoon. The crew was framing the walls. The rhythmic, satisfying thwack, thwack, thwack of nail guns filled the air. It was the sound of progress. To Carol, apparently, it was the sound of chaos. I was inside making a fresh pitcher of lemonade for the guys when I saw the patrol car roll slowly down the street. It pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers got out. One was older, with a mustache that looked like it had seen things, and a deep, profound weariness in his eyes. The other was young, barely out of the academy, with a ramrod-straight posture and an earnest expression. I walked outside, my heart sinking. Miguel had already stopped the crew. They were all standing there, looking nervous. "Folks," the older officer said, his voice flat. He had a name tag that read Miller. "We got a call about a disturbance, something about unpermitted construction and excessive noise." Before I could even speak, I had my Citadel binder in my hand. I had started carrying it around with me like a security blanket. I opened it on the hood of his car. "Officer Miller," I said, pointing to each document. "Here is the stamped and approved city permit. Here is the official, notarized letter of approval from the Homeowners Association. And here is a copy of the City Noise Ordinance, which, as you can see, allows for construction noise up to 90 decibels between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on weekdays. It is currently 1:30 p.m. on a Wednesday." I pulled out my phone. And according to my app, which I downloaded specifically for this purpose, the ambient noise from the nail guns is hovering around a pleasant 75 decibels. The sound of freedom, I like to call it. Miller looked at my binder, then at the half-framed structure, then over at Carol, who was watching intently from her front lawn, her arms crossed. He sighed, a deep, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of every stupid neighbor dispute he'd ever had to deal with. The younger officer, Davis, walked over to Carol. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of official politeness. "They appear to have all their paperwork in order. They're well within the legal noise limits." Carol was not deterred. "It's the tone of the hammering," she insisted, her voice rising. "It's aggressive. It's disturbing the peace of the neighborhood." I saw Officer Miller's eye twitch. He turned to Davis and said, just loud enough for me and Miguel to hear, "Just put it down as civil dispute, malicious hammering." "Let's go. I miss chasing actual criminals." They got back in their car and drove away. Miguel looked at me and started to laugh. "Malicious hammering? Man, I gotta remember that one." But I wasn't laughing. She had crossed a line. She had wasted the time of law enforcement over the tone of a nail gun. This was no longer a game. This was madness. I realized I couldn't fight this war on my own anymore. I needed bigger guns. I needed an ally who understood the dark arts of bureaucracy better than I did. I needed Dave. Dave Johnson and I went way back. We'd met 20 years ago on a nightmare project involving a sinkhole, a sewer main, and a mayor who wanted it all fixed in time for the annual Founders' Day parade. I was the frantic young engineer. He was the unflappable senior guy from Public Works who had seen it all. We'd bonded over bad coffee and the shared misery of dealing with politicians. Now, he was the deputy director of the entire department. I met him at the Salty Dog, a dive bar near the city maintenance yards that smelled of stale beer and quiet competence. I laid out the whole saga, from the toasted almond trim to the malicious hammering. Dave listened patiently, nursing a beer, a slow grin spreading across his face. "An HOA, huh, Alex? You moved into an HOA. I always figured you were smarter than that." "It was for the schools," I grumbled. "My wife insisted. Now I'm living in a beige dictatorship. She's going to try and stop the concrete pour next week, Dave." "I know she is. It's the one part of the project that's time critical. If she delays those trucks, the whole foundation is shot." Dave leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the kind of light you see in a man who truly loves his job. "Let me see the plat map for your subdivision." I pulled it up on my phone. It was a standard grid of lots and streets. But Dave wasn't looking at the lots. He was looking at the edges. His finger traced a dotted line running behind my property. "Well, well, well," he rumbled. "Look at that. Classic rookie developer mistake from the 90s. "What is it?" "Your property," he said, his grin widening. "Backs up onto a public utility easement. That little dead-end road behind your fence, the one with the fire gate, that's not HOA property. That's city access. They have to keep it clear for emergency vehicles and, more importantly," he paused for dramatic effect, "for public works." I stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. "You're kidding me." "Nope," Dave said, taking a triumphant sip of his beer. "She thinks that gate is hers to control. It's not. She touches that gate, she's not messing with Alex Stevens, homeowner. She's messing with the City of Northwood Department of Public Works. And trust me, Alex, we have bigger trucks." A plan began to form. A beautiful, devious, and entirely legal plan. I would schedule the concrete delivery for the main entrance as planned, but if and when Carol tried to interfere, I had a backup, a contingency. "So if she were to, say, block that gate," I began, "she would be obstructing a designated fire lane and impeding access to a public utility," Dave finished, his eyes twinkling. "That's a Class B municipal infraction. Comes with a hefty fine. And it gives us the authority to remove the obstruction." I felt a surge of adrenaline. "Dave, can you be on standby next Friday morning?" Dave leaned back and let out a laugh that shook the whole bar. "Alex, my friend, for a chance to put an HOA president in her place, I will clear my entire schedule. Just give me the signal." The signal. We decided on Code Karen. It felt appropriate. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place at the annual Serenity Meadows HOA BBQ. I went reluctantly, hoping to maybe build a little goodwill, to show my face and prove I wasn't the monster Carol was making me out to be. It was a disaster. Carol held court by the hot dogs, loudly telling a captivated audience of my neighbors how my industrial complex was a blight on the community and was single-handedly responsible for a chipmunk infestation. I was standing awkwardly by the potato salad, trying to become invisible, when a woman named Sarah sidled up to me. "Hey," she whispered, not making eye contact. "I'm in number 42. Just wanted you to know we all think she's insane. My husband had to repaint our mailbox 3 times because the shade of white wasn't crisp enough. We're all rooting for you quietly." She patted my arm and slipped away before Carol could see her. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. I had silent allies. They were too intimidated to speak up, but they were there. It strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my workshop anymore. I was fighting for mailbox freedom and the right to own a slightly too tall gnome. The night before the concrete pour, I couldn't sleep. Miguel had called to confirm. 3 trucks from rock-solid concrete, starting at 9 a.m. sharp. Once that first chute opened, there was no stopping. Any delay of more than an hour, and we'd have a 10-cubic-yard permanently hardened monument to failure in my backyard. I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the dark shape of my half-built citadel. The moonlight glinted off the wooden frame. It was beautiful. Then I saw a light flick on in Carol's house. I saw her silhouette in the window, looking out at my property. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that she was planning something. She was a predator, and my foundation was her prey. I just hoped my trap was big enough, which brings us back to here. Friday morning, 8:55 a.m. Me, my phone pressed to my ear like a lifeline, a river of liquid stone waiting to be poured, and Queen Carol of the cul-de-sac holding my entire project, my dream, hostage with a glorified minivan that had never seen a speck of mud in its life. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The sheer, unmitigated gall was almost impressive. She hadn't tried to block my driveway. That was too simple, too direct. No, she had gone for what she perceived as the weak flank. She'd seen the fire gate, a rarely used access point, and assumed it was her trump card. An unguarded back door to my plans. She had no idea she wasn't blocking my gate. She was blockading a city artery. "What's the plan, boss?" Miguel asked, walking up beside me. He had a look of profound resignation, the look of a man who had seen humanity at its absolute worst, usually over fence heights. I allowed myself a small, tight smile. "The plan, Miguel, is to introduce a suburbanite versus predator scenario," I said, looking at the pearl-white SUV gleaming in the sun. "And she is not the predator." The first concrete truck had already navigated the winding streets of Serenity Meadows and was now idling patiently at the end of my driveway, its giant drum turning slowly. The driver, a guy with a magnificent beard and a t-shirt that said, "I like big mixers and I cannot lie," caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up. He was enjoying the show. Carol saw the truck arrive. Her smug smile widened. She thought she had me cornered, my primary and secondary access points both rendered useless. She was a chess player who had just yelled checkmate, not realizing her opponent was about to flip the board over and hit her with it. My phone was still pressed to my ear. Dave's voice was the calm in the storm. "I'm turning onto your main street now. I see the concrete truck. Just keep her occupied." "Occupied?" I muttered. "I think she's building a nest." I decided to engage. I walked slowly, deliberately, down my driveway and across the street, stopping a respectable 10 feet from her and her vehicular fortress. "Morning, Carol," I said, my voice as level as a freshly poured slab. "Bit of a parking snafu you've got there. You're blocking the fire gate." "This is a private road, Mr. Stevens," she sniffed, adjusting the collar of her beige jacket. "And this gate is for emergencies only. A workshop is not an emergency." "Funny you should mention emergencies," I said, just as the low rumble I'd heard earlier grew into a full-throated roar. Heads turned. The concrete truck driver sat up straighter. Miguel's crew all stopped what they were doing. Even Bob, who had emerged onto Carol's porch to watch his wife's glorious triumph, looked confused. It crested the hill of our aggressively picturesque street like a mythical beast. It was a massive, bright yellow City of Northwood dump truck. It wasn't just a truck, it was a statement. It was so scarred and dented from years of honest work. It had a heavy-duty plow attachment bracket on the front that looked like it could move a mountain, and emblazoned on the side, in big, bold, authoritative letters, was the city seal and the words, "Department of Public Works." The truck didn't slow down. It rumbled past my house, past the concrete mixer, and pulled right up to the other side of the fire gate, its air brakes hissing loudly, defiantly, in the quiet morning air. The driver's side door swung open, and out climbed Dave Johnson. He wasn't in his office polo today. He was in his field gear, a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and a high-visibility vest so bright it threatened to burn out your retinas. He looked like a god of asphalt and infrastructure. Carol stared, her smugness finally faltering, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This wasn't part of her plan. Dave ignored her completely at first. He walked to the gate, pulled a huge ring of keys from his belt, and rattled the massive padlock. Then, he turned to Carol. His voice wasn't angry. It was far more terrifying. It was the voice of pure, unassailable authority. "Ma'am," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cul-de-sac, You are currently obstructing a designated public utility and emergency vehicle access point in direct violation of City of Northwood Municipal Ordinance 4.17, subsection B. I need you to move your vehicle immediately." Carol, momentarily stunned, quickly recovered her indignation. "This is private property. I am the president of this homeowners association. Who do you think you are?" Dave pointed a thick finger at the city seal on his truck. "I'm the guy who thinks this easement is city property, ma'am, because it is. My authority comes from that seal, and that ordinance. You've got 60 seconds to move your truck before I have it moved for you." "You can't do that!" she shrieked. "I'm going to call the police." "No need," I said cheerfully. "Looks like they're already here." As if on cue, the same police cruiser from the malicious hammering incident rolled up. Officers Miller and Davis got out. Miller's mustache seemed to droop even more than usual. He took in the scene. Me, Miguel's crew, the concrete truck, Carol, her Escalade, Dave, and his municipal behemoth. And he looked, for all the world, like a man who was seconds away from just retiring on the spot. Carol's face lit up. Her cavalry had arrived. "Officers, thank goodness!" she cried, rushing towards them. "This man is trespassing on our property, and he's threatening to damage my vehicle." Officer Miller didn't even look at Dave. His weary eyes were fixed on Carol. "Ma'am, I've had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Johnson from Public Works on several occasions, usually when someone like you does something like this. He works for the city. That truck is a city vehicle. That access road," he said, pointing a thumb over his shoulder, "is a city easement and a designated fire lane. He is asking you to move. As a police officer, I am now telling you to move. Right now." This was it. The moment of truth. Every resident who had been peeking from behind their curtains was now openly standing in their doorway. My neighbor Sarah from number 42 gave me a small, encouraging wave. Carol's face was a storm of conflicting emotions: rage, disbelief, humiliation. But stubbornness won out. She drew herself up to her full height. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I will not." Officer Miller looked at Dave. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. It was the universal sign for, "She's all yours." Dave nodded grimly. He turned not to a tow hook or a winch. That would be too complicated, too slow. He walked back to his bright yellow truck, climbed into the cab, and fired up the engine. It roared to life, a sound of pure, unadulterated power. He put the truck in a low gear. He didn't rev the engine. He just let it roll forward. The massive, reinforced steel bumper of the city truck made contact with the plastic bumper of the pearl-white Escalade. The sound was glorious. It began with a gentle creak, then a louder crunch as plastic and decorative chrome gave way. Then a deep, guttural groan as 2.5 tons of luxury SUV was slowly, inexorably, and disrespectfully shoved sideways. The tires, locked in park, screeched in protest against the asphalt before the entire vehicle was pushed up and over the curb. It plowed 2 perfect deep ruts into the HOA's obsessively manicured lawn, the very lawn whose sanctity Carol claimed to be protecting. Carol let out a shriek. It was a sound of pure, primal horror, the sound a person makes when they see their world view and their vehicle's resale value being simultaneously destroyed. The whole event took maybe 15 seconds. Dave stopped his truck, the Escalade now sitting at a jaunty, pathetic angle on the grass, looking like a beached whale. He got out, the air brakes hissing triumphantly. He walked to the gate, unlocked the padlock with a satisfying clank, and swung the heavy gate open. Then he turned to the driver of the rock-solid concrete truck and gave him a wave. "You're clear." Miguel and his crew, who had been watching in stunned, reverent silence, burst into spontaneous applause. As the first cement mixer rumbled through the gate and backed up to my foundation, Officer Davis walked over to the shrieking Carol and began writing her a very, very expensive ticket for obstructing a fire lane. Officer Miller just stood there, shaking his head, a tiny smirk finally breaking through the gloom of his mustache. I walked over to Dave, who was leaning against his truck, looking immensely satisfied. "You know," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "that was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Dave just grinned. "All in a day's work. Now are you going to pour this thing or what?" The concrete pour was flawless. It was a ballet of chutes, wheelbarrows, and skilled workers spreading and smoothing the gray slurry that would become the bedrock of my dream. With every cubic foot of concrete that filled the forms, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. When it was all done, the foundation smooth and perfect, Miguel slapped me on the back. "Boss," he said, a huge grin on his face, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen some crazy stuff, but I ain't never seen anything like that. That was legendary." A week later, an email went out. Emergency HOA meeting. The subject was discussion of recent community disturbances and property damage. Carol was making her last stand. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. Word had spread. The legend of the public works push was already neighborhood lore. Carol, looking haggard but defiant, stood at the podium. She launched into a tirade, her voice trembling with rage. She spoke of rogue construction, wanton destruction of common property, referring to the ruts her own car made, and the unbecoming conduct of a resident who would enlist city cronies to bully his neighbors. She proposed levying the maximum possible fine against me and a formal motion to have my industrial structure removed. When she finished, the room was silent. She looked around, expecting support. Then I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the podium with my binder. "Carol has made some interesting points," I began calmly. "I'd just like to add some context." I put up a photo I'd taken of her SUV blocking the gate. Then a photo of the fire lane no parking sign she was parked directly in front of. I then read aloud the relevant section of Officer Miller's police report, which clearly stated she had refused multiple orders from both Public Works and law enforcement to move her vehicle. Finally, I read City Ordinance 4.17 in its entirety. "The damage to the lawn was unfortunate," I concluded, "but it was a direct result of a clear and deliberate violation of city law. A violation that, I might add, put our entire community at risk by blocking emergency access." I sat down. The silence was different this time. It was thoughtful. And then a new voice cut through the tension. It was Sarah from number 42. She stood up, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice clear. "For 5 years," she said, looking around the room, "we have all lived in fear of this kind of thing. My husband had to repaint our mailbox, our white mailbox, 3 times to get a shade of white that Carol deemed crisp enough. We got a violation notice because our son's bicycle was left on our own driveway for 2 hours. This has never been about standards. It's been about control." A man in the back stood up. "She made us dig up our prize-winning roses because they weren't on the pre-approved shrubbery list." Another woman stood. "The gnome!" shouted Mrs. Gable, the victim from my first meeting. "She hates my gnome." Suddenly, the dam broke. A flood of grievances, big and small, filled the room. The tyranny of beige, the war on lawn ornaments, the endless petty violation notices. It was all laid bare. Carol stood at the front, her face pale, as her kingdom crumbled around her. A man I recognized as Tom, a quiet accountant from down the street, stood up and cleared his throat. "I move for a vote of no confidence in our current HOA president." "Seconded," came a chorus of voices. The vote wasn't even close. It was a landslide. Carol was dethroned in a flurry of raised hands. 3 months later, I stood on the small porch of my finished citadel. It was magnificent. The toasted almond trim looked fantastic against the cedar. The inside smelled of fresh-cut wood and possibility. A "For Sale" sign was planted in Carol's lawn, which still bore the faint scars of her last stand. Tom, the new HOA president, walked by with his golden retriever. He gave me a friendly wave. "Looking good, Alex," he called out. I had already gotten a notice from the new board. It was a flyer for a potluck, with a handwritten note at the bottom. "Gnomes and all shades of beige are welcome." The door to the citadel opened, and Dave stepped out, holding 2 cold beers. He'd come by to inspect the final wiring, a favor for a friend. He handed me a bottle, and we stood there, looking at my creation. "So," he said, taking a long drink, "was it worth it? All this chaos, the police, the near-international incident, all for a shed?" I looked at the workshop, my fortress, my sanctuary. I thought about the battle of the bylaws, the malicious hammering, and the glorious, beautiful sound of crunching plastic. I smiled. "First," I said, holding up my beer in a toast, "it's a citadel. And second, yeah, Dave, it was worth every single glorious, petty, wonderful minute of it. They say a man's home is his castle. They just never tell you that sometimes you have to remind the neighbors where the moat is, and who, when push comes to shove, drives the bigger truck."